Big Shaquille O'Neal steps in to protect a 76-year-old black woman from a racist cop's assault in an Atlanta parking lot. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. It was a scorching afternoon in Atlanta, the kind that made people retreat indoors or hurry to finish errands. In the parking lot of a popular grocery store, Miss Hattie Mae Jenkins, a dignified 76-year-old black woman, was gathering her bags when a store clerk rushed out, accusing her of stealing. Ms. Jenkins, confused and slightly offended, explained that she had paid for everything but had misplaced her receipt. The young clerk, new to the job and visibly nervous, insisted she wait as he called for security. Minutes later, Officer Tom Callahan, a young white cop with a reputation for being quick-tempered, arrived on the scene. He strode toward Ms. Jenkins with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. The elderly woman stood her ground, leaning on her cane but refusing to show fear. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice steady despite her rising frustration. Callahan, however, dismissed her words, his tone condescending as he demanded proof of purchase. When she couldn't produce the receipt, his demeanor shifted from skeptical to aggressive. "Ma'am, I'm not asking again," he said sharply, stepping closer. Ms. Jenkins, her patience worn thin, replied, "You're young enough to be my grandson. Show some respect." The tension escalated as Callahan grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back. She cried out, the sound sharp and piercing, drawing the attention of shoppers nearby. A crowd began to form, some pulling out their phones to record the altercation. "She's an old woman. Let her go," someone shouted. Others murmured among themselves, their anger simmering, but their fear of intervening palpable. Ms. Jenkins struggled, her dignity unraveling as Callahan forced her against the side of her car. At that moment, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot, its tinted windows concealing its passenger. The vehicle came to an abrupt stop, and out stepped Shaquille O'Neal. Big Shaq himself, towering at over 7 feet, the retired NBA legend and beloved community advocate, cut an imposing figure dressed casually in a polo shirt and khakis. He looked every bit the gentle giant, but his expression was anything but gentle as he took in the scene before him. Shaq moved with purpose, his long strides eating up the distance between him and the officer. Callahan turned momentarily, taken aback by the sheer size and presence of the man confronting him. "Sir, step back. This is police business," Callahan barked, though his voice wavered slightly with the awareness of the gun pointed in his direction. "Sir, don't..." Shaq didn't step back. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze locking onto Callahan's. "This woman is no threat. She's someone's grandmother," he said, his tone calm but firm. Callahan's face flushed with a mix of anger and uncertainty as the crowd began murmuring louder, emboldened by Shaq's presence. In a desperate bid to regain control, Callahan pulled out his taser, pointing it at Shaq. The crowd gasped, several people shouting in protest. Shaq raised his hands, palms open, but his voice remained steady. "You're really going to pull that on me in front of all these people?" he asked, gesturing to the growing crowd. Callahan hesitated, the weight of dozens of smartphones pointed in his direction finally registering. Shaq knelt beside Ms. Jenkins, his massive frame shielding her from the officer. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked gently, his voice softening. Ms. Jenkins nodded, her face streaked with tears but her pride intact. "Thank you," she whispered, turning back to Callahan. Shaq said, "You need to let her go now." The officer, clearly flustered, lowered the taser but didn't release Ms. Jenkins. Shaq pulled out his phone and began recording. "This is how you treat our elders?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. The crowd erupted in applause, their collective anger transforming into solidarity. Faced with the undeniable reality of the situation and the looming figure of Shaquille O'Neal, Callahan reluctantly let Ms. Jenkins go. She rubbed her wrist, wincing slightly, but her eyes held a glimmer of triumph. Shaq helped her to her feet, steadying her with a hand as big as her shoulder. As Callahan retreated to his patrol car, muttering into his radio, Shaq turned to the crowd. "We've got to take care of each other," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. He escorted Ms. Jenkins to her car, ensuring she was safe before turning back to face the crowd. "This ain't over," he said, his gaze sweeping over the onlookers. Not by a long shot. The seeds of change had been planted right there in that parking lot. What had started as a routine trip to the grocery store would soon become a catalyst for a national reckoning. The tension in the parking lot reached a boiling point as Officer Callahan, still clutching his taser, stared down the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal. Callahan's hands trembled slightly, a combination of adrenaline and uncertainty coursing through him. "Sir, step back," he barked, his voice sharp but lacking the authority it once carried. The crowd, now numbering in the hundreds, raised their voices in unison, demanding justice and de-escalation. Shaq stood his ground, his massive frame unyielding. His years as an athlete had trained him to remain calm under pressure, and his recent work as a community advocate had taught him the power of presence. He raised one hand, signaling to the crowd to stay calm while his other hand gripped his phone, recording the scene. "Officer, you're on live right now," Shaq said, his voice deep and steady. "The whole world is watching." Callahan froze for a moment, his eyes flickering toward the crowd of phones pointed in his direction. The realization that he was being filmed and that the man standing before him was one of the most recognizable figures in the country seemed to sink in. His bravado faltered. "I'm just doing my job," he muttered defensively, and the taser in his hand suggested otherwise. Shaq took a step closer, his sheer presence making Callahan appear small in comparison. "Your job," Shaq said, his tone measured, "is to protect and serve, not to bully and hurt people who can't defend themselves." He gestured toward Ms. Jenkins, who was still rubbing her wrist, her expression a mix of pain and defiance. "She's not a threat. She's not a criminal. She's someone's grandmother." The crowd began to cheer, emboldened by Shaq's words. "Let her go," someone shouted, and others quickly joined in, chanting in unison. The air buzzed with a mix of anger and hope, a collective yearning for justice that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Callahan, now visibly sweating, lowered the taser slightly but didn't holster it. His authority, once unchallenged, was now slipping away in the face of Shaq's calm defiance and the crowd's growing support. Sensing the officer's hesitation, Shaq shifted his approach. He knelt down beside Ms. Jenkins, his massive frame creating a protective barrier between her and the officer. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice full of genuine concern, "are you okay? Did he hurt you?" Ms. Jenkins looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice steady despite the ordeal. "Thank you for stepping in, son." Her words carried the weight of generations of struggle, and Shaq felt it. He nodded, his jaw tightening as he turned his attention back to Callahan. "You need to let her go," Shaq said firmly. "Right now." Callahan hesitated, glancing at the crowd, at Shaq, and at his own hands. Slowly, he unclipped the cuffs from his belt, but the damage had already been done. The crowd erupted in applause as he stepped back, giving Ms. Jenkins the space she deserved. Shaq stood, his imposing figure towering over Callahan. He didn't say another word to the officer. He didn't need to. His silence was a statement in itself, a reminder of the power of accountability and the weight of public scrutiny. Turning to the crowd, Shaq raised his phone high, ensuring the live stream captured every angle. "This isn't just about Ms. Jenkins," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "This is about all of us. We've got to stand together when we see injustice. We've got to speak up. That's how we make change." The crowd erupted in cheers, their applause a mix of gratitude and determination. For many, this moment was more than just an intervention. It was a call to action. Shaq helped Ms. Jenkins to her feet, offering her his arm as she steadied herself. "Let me get you to your car," he said, his tone gentle as they walked away. Callahan retreated to his patrol car, his face flushed with humiliation. He muttered into his radio, calling for backup, but the damage to his reputation was already done. The crowd dispersed slowly, but not before several people approached Ms. Jenkins to offer their support. One woman handed her a bottle of water while another promised to share the video far and wide. Before leaving, Shaq turned to the remaining onlookers. "Remember this moment," he said. "It's not just about what happened here today. It's about what we do tomorrow and the day after that to make sure this doesn't happen again." As the SUV pulled away, carrying Shaq and Ms. Jenkins to safety, the crowd lingered, the weight of what they had witnessed settling in. This was more than an isolated incident. It was a spark that would ignite something much larger. By the time Shaq pulled into his driveway later that evening, the footage of the parking lot incident was already spreading like wildfire across social media. Shaq's phone buzzed non-stop with notifications, text messages from friends, reposts of the live video, and mentions from prominent activists and celebrities. The video had gone viral, racking up millions of views within hours. The hashtag Justice for Hattie and hashtag #ShaqStandsTall trended across platforms, becoming rallying cries for a movement that had long been simmering beneath the surface. The video wasn't just a record of police misconduct. It was a raw and unfiltered moment that exposed the reality of systemic injustice. The sight of an elderly black woman being manhandled by an officer contrasted sharply with the image of Shaq, a cultural icon using his fame and physical presence to protect her. News outlets quickly picked up the story, dissecting the footage from every angle. Some praised Shaq as a hero, while others criticized him for interfering with law enforcement. Regardless of the spin, one thing was clear: the incident had struck a nerve. Shaq, however, wasn't focused on the headlines that night. He called his team and began organizing a press conference for the following day. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady but determined. "This is about what's happening to our people every day. We have to make this bigger than just one incident." By morning, reporters, activists, and curious onlookers crowded into a local community center where Shaq had chosen to hold the event. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as Shaq entered the room, towering over the podium yet exuding humility. Beside him stood Miss Hattie Mae Jenkins, her wrist still sore but her spirit unbroken. Shaq began by recounting the events of the previous day, his deep voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "What happened to Ms. Jenkins is not new," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words settle. "It's part of a pattern that has gone on for far too long. We cannot keep turning a blind eye to it." Miss Jenkins, dressed in her Sunday best, stepped forward next. Despite her soft-spoken nature, her words carried a powerful resonance. "I've lived through a lot in my 76 years, she said, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "I've seen the worst of this country and the best of it. Yesterday, I saw hope. Hope in the faces of the people who stood up for me and hope in the actions of this kind man." She glanced up at Shaq, her gratitude evident. The press conference was more than just a retelling of the incident. It was a rallying cry. Shaq called on lawmakers to enact meaningful reforms, on communities to stand in solidarity, and on law enforcement to take accountability for their actions. "This isn't just an Atlanta problem," he said, his tone somber but resolute. "This is an American problem, and it's going to take all of us to fix it." Within hours, clips from the press conference began circulating online, amplifying the conversation. Activists from across the country shared the footage, adding their own stories and demands for change. Civil rights organizations seized the moment, organizing protests and town hall meetings to address the broader issues of police brutality and systemic racism. Even celebrities and athletes joined the movement, using their platforms to draw attention to the incident. Some donated to legal defense funds for victims of police misconduct, while others attended rallies and marches. Shaq's involvement lent the movement a sense of urgency and visibility that few could ignore. Meanwhile, the Atlanta Police Department found itself under intense scrutiny. Officer Callahan was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but the public demanded more than a temporary suspension. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Hattie Mae," and "Accountability Now." For his part, Shaq remained focused on the bigger picture. He spent the days following the press conference meeting with community leaders, lawmakers, and activists. He hosted a virtual town hall where he invited victims of police misconduct to share their stories. "We need to hear from the people who've lived this," he said during the event. "Their voices are the ones that matter most." The momentum continued to build. Social media became a powerful tool for organizing and educating, with activists sharing resources on how to hold law enforcement accountable and push for policy changes. The video of Shaq's intervention became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, individuals have the power to stand up and demand better. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of the parking lot incident spread far beyond Atlanta. Conversations about race, policing, and systemic inequality grew louder, forcing even the most reluctant individuals to confront uncomfortable truths. The nation was at a tipping point, and it was clear that change was no longer just a possibility. It was an inevitability. For Shaq, the incident marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He had always been a beloved public figure, but now he was a symbol of justice and accountability. And while he appreciated the recognition, he remained grounded in his mission. "This isn't about me being a hero," he often said in interviews. "This is about making sure no one else has to go through what Ms. Jenkins went through. That's the only thing that matters." The video of that fateful day in the parking lot became more than just a viral moment. It became a catalyst for a nationwide reckoning. For the millions who watched, it was a reminder that change often begins with one person standing tall, even when the odds are stacked against them. The incident in the Atlanta grocery store parking lot sparked a tidal wave of action across the country. What had begun as a single act of courage by Shaquille O'Neal quickly transformed into a movement that galvanized communities, amplified long-simmering grievances, and forced systemic racism in law enforcement into the national spotlight. In Atlanta, the protests began just hours after Shaq's press conference. By the next morning, hundreds of people had gathered outside the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, holding signs that read, "Justice for Hattie Mae, protect and serve all, and end police brutality." The crowd was diverse, young and old, black and white, working-class families, and college students. Many were first-time protesters drawn to action by the undeniable injustice of Ms. Jenkins's treatment. Civil rights organizations quickly mobilized, using the momentum to push for sweeping reforms. At the forefront of these efforts was the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP, which organized a series of town hall meetings to address the community's concerns. Shaq, true to his promise, attended every session. He didn't just speak, he listened. Mothers of victims shared stories of sons and daughters lost to police violence, while young activists called for immediate action. "This isn't just about bad cops," one young woman said, her voice trembling with emotion during a packed town hall. "This is about a system that protects them no matter what they do. We're tired of being afraid. We're tired of waiting for change." Shaq nodded, his expression serious. "I hear you," he said, leaning into the microphone. "And I'm with you, but we've got to do this the right way. We've got to stay united, stay peaceful, and stay focused. That's how we'll win." His words resonated deeply, and his presence lent credibility and urgency to the movement. The impact of the incident extended far beyond Atlanta. Across the country, communities held rallies and marches, each one echoing the themes of justice, accountability, and the need for systemic reform. Social media became a hub for organizing, with activists sharing resources on how to contact lawmakers, attend city council meetings, and demand transparency from police departments. The hashtags #JusticeForHattie and #ShaqStandsTall remained trending for weeks, ensuring the momentum didn't wane. The incident also ignited difficult conversations in unlikely places. Families who had never spoken openly about race or policing found themselves grappling with uncomfortable truths. Churches and schools hosted discussions about systemic racism, while corporate boardrooms debated how to address diversity and equity within their organizations. Even the Atlanta Police Department felt the heat. Under immense public pressure, they launched an internal investigation into Officer Callahan's actions, placing him on unpaid administrative leave. Community activists demanded more than a symbolic gesture. They wanted real accountability. "Suspending one officer isn't enough," said Reverend James Carter, a prominent Atlanta pastor and activist during a televised interview. "This is about dismantling the culture that allows these abuses to happen in the first place." Meanwhile, Shaq continued to use his platform to amplify the movement. He appeared on national news programs, not to bask in the spotlight, but to redirect attention to the larger issues at hand. "This isn't just about Ms. Jenkins or what happened that day," he said during an interview on CNN. "This is about making sure it doesn't happen again. To her, to your grandmother, to anyone." Shaq also partnered with local leaders to organize community forums focused on actionable solutions. One of the key proposals was mandatory de-escalation training for police officers, alongside independent oversight committees to investigate allegations of misconduct. "We need to change the way we think about policing," Shaq said during one forum. "It's not about us versus them. It's about protecting all of us equally." Shaq's involvement inspired others to step forward. Fellow athletes, musicians, and celebrities joined the cause, attending rallies, donating to legal defense funds, and speaking out on social media. Some, like former NBA players, shared their own stories of racial profiling and police harassment. Their collective voices added weight to the movement, making it impossible for the broader public to ignore. But the ripple effects weren't limited to policy and protest. Hattie Mae Jenkins, once a quiet, unassuming retiree, found herself thrust into the role of a symbol for resilience and justice. Though initially reluctant to step into the spotlight, she soon realized the power of her story. "If my pain can help others," she said during a televised interview, "then I'll speak as loud as I can, because this fight isn't just for me, it's for all of us." The wave of activism brought tangible results. Within weeks, Atlanta's City Council passed a resolution mandating body cameras for all officers and increased funding for community-led public safety initiatives. Other cities, inspired by Atlanta's progress, began implementing similar measures. The ripple effect continued to spread, reaching Washington, D.C., where lawmakers began debating a federal bill to address police reform. Though the road to national change was long and fraught with opposition, the movement born from a grocery store parking lot had laid the groundwork for a reckoning that could not be ignored. Through it all, Shaq remained a steady presence, attending rallies, hosting meetings, and reminding everyone of the importance of unity and perseverance. "We're just getting started," he told a crowd of thousands during a peaceful march through downtown Atlanta. "The fight for justice doesn't end with one protest or one law. It ends when we've changed the system for good." The ripple effect born from one act of courage was reshaping the nation, and for those who had witnessed it firsthand, there was no going back. Change was no longer a distant hope. It was a tangible force fueled by the determination of millions. Months after the incident in Atlanta, the ripple effects of that fateful day had grown into a national wave of change. The once localized outrage over Ms. Hattie Mae Jenkins's mistreatment and Shaquille O'Neal's intervention had sparked a cultural reckoning across the United States. Communities, lawmakers, and activists worked tirelessly to confront systemic racism in policing and push for meaningful reforms. The culmination of these efforts came in the form of a historic bill signing at the White House. The event was broadcast live across the country, with millions tuning in to witness the moment. Among the attendees were Ms. Jenkins and Shaq, both invited as honored guests. Ms. Jenkins, now affectionately known as Grandma Hattie by supporters, wore a wide-brimmed hat and a modest pastel suit. Shaq, towering beside her in a tailored black suit, was a mix of solemnity and pride. The legislation, known as the Justice and Accountability Act, was far from perfect, but it marked a significant step forward. The law mandated stricter use of force protocols, independent investigations into police misconduct, and the widespread implementation of body cameras. It also included funding for community policing initiatives and de-escalation training for officers. The bill was both a victory and a reminder that the fight was far from over. When it was her turn to speak, Ms. Jenkins approached the podium with slow, measured steps. Despite her age and the gravity of the occasion, her voice carried a quiet strength. "I'm just an old woman who went to buy some oranges," she began, drawing a ripple of knowing laughter from the audience. "But that day in the parking lot, I learned something. I learned that even the smallest of us can be a part of something big. I didn't ask for this fight, but I'm proud to be in it because it's a fight for all of us." Her words were met with a standing ovation, her humility and resilience a beacon of hope for those watching. Shaq followed her, stepping up to the podium with his characteristic blend of gravitas and warmth. "This is a moment," he said, his deep voice resonating through the room. "But it's not the finish line. Real change takes time, effort, and all of us working together. This bill is just the beginning. Let's keep going." Outside the White House, thousands gathered in celebration. The mood was electric, filled with music, chants, and signs that read, "We the people made this happen," and "Justice for Hattie Mae is justice for all." The crowd was a testament to the power of collective action, a diverse mix of faces united by a shared goal. Beyond the legislative victories, the movement had created a cultural shift. Police departments across the country began implementing reforms, not just because of legal mandates, but because of public demand. Trainings introduced new curricula focused on implicit bias and conflict resolution, while independent review boards were established to investigate complaints against officers. For the first time in decades, public trust in law enforcement began to rise, albeit cautiously. The private sector also took notice. Corporations launched initiatives to address systemic racism, pledging support for community programs and diversity training. Schools incorporated lessons about racial justice into their curriculums, ensuring that the next generation would grow up with a deeper understanding of equity and fairness. Even Hollywood responded, with films and documentaries highlighting the stories of those who had suffered and those who had fought for change. For Shaq, the journey didn't end with the bill signing. He became a full-time advocate for justice, leveraging his fame and resources to support grassroots organizations and amplify marginalized voices. He traveled the country meeting with families affected by police violence, speaking at rallies and conferences. His foundation, once focused on education and sports, expanded its mission to include social justice initiatives, funding legal aid programs and scholarships for students pursuing careers in public policy. Ms. Hattie Mae Jenkins, too, found herself in an unexpected new role. Though she initially resisted the spotlight, she eventually embraced her status as a symbol of resilience. She attended events, spoke at schools and churches, and even wrote a memoir titled Grace Under Fire, which chronicled her life and the transformative power of community. Her story became a bestseller, inspiring countless readers with her message of hope and perseverance. The parking lot where it all began became a site of reflection and remembrance. A mural was painted on the side of the grocery store depicting Ms. Jenkins and Shaq standing together, surrounded by a diverse crowd. The mural's caption read, "Change starts here." It became a place where people came to honor the movement, leaving flowers, letters, and candles as a tribute to the lives it had touched and the hope it had inspired. As the nation moved forward, the legacy of that day in Atlanta remained a powerful reminder of what could be achieved when individuals stood up for what was right. The grocery store parking lot had been a battlefield of injustice, but it had also been the birthplace of a movement that reshaped the country. For Ms. Jenkins, her life returned to something resembling normalcy. She continued to live in her modest home, tending to her garden and attending Sunday church services. But she carried with her the knowledge that her struggle had not been in vain. And for Shaq, the parking lot incident marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where he used his voice, his platform, and his unwavering sense of justice to make a difference. In the end, the nation had been forced to confront its own flaws, and while the road ahead was still long, the progress made was undeniable. What began as a small act of courage in a parking lot had grown into a transformative force, proving that change, no matter how daunting, always begins with someone willing to stand up and say, "Enough." Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, leave a comment below with your thoughts or share similar stories from your community. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be the first to see our next video.